College football nerds here talking Penn State, talking SMU, and this is going to be a fun one for us. Y'all might be new to this channel, especially SMU fans. Want you to know that we have a wonderful computer model that's actually done very well this year in the last few years, so you're going to want to pay attention because it's got something interesting to say about SMU. I got Josh with me. He's going to get nerdy with y'all, and we're going to just right off the jump, Josh. This is an interesting matchup for me. We were pretty vocal that we thought Alabama should be in the playoffs, technically over SMU, but really over Clemson, the technicality that they got in. But a lot of people might be sleeping on this SMU team. I want you to get into that. But first, I want to talk about Penn State. So one thing that's kind of frustrating about Penn State, at least throughout the early part of the schedule, is they only played the one other top team in the Big Ten. We didn't expect to see them against Oregon. We didn't expect Michigan to beat Ohio State. We did get to see that game against Oregon. So now we have 2 data points. We have 2 data points of Penn State not winning games against playoff teams, but being ultra competitive. Lost both of those games by 1 score. I'm not into moral victories, but in terms of just understanding a team's ability to navigate a playoff schedule or play playoff level football, is it not a positive, turning a negative into a positive, Josh, that Penn State was able to hang with both of these teams, be highly competitive, and there at the very end?
Something I always try to explain when we're doing these projections is whether or not you won or lost a particular game matters to me when we're doing our personal rankings, like when we do our top 12s. It doesn't matter to me really almost at all when we're talking about evaluating your team in terms of future performance. There's a lot of evidence of this. But in general, when you talk power ratings, when you talk about projections for wins in the future, how you play in the games overall is the thing that matters the most. And there is something to teams that can't close out wins, Ohio State. But there's also something to be said for the fact that you can or cannot play with certain teams. When you play bad teams, do you dominate them? Do you not dominate them? And to that point, Daniel, Penn State has been pretty consistently good through the season, right? I mean, Illinois was 21-7. We go back and forth with fans all the time. I'll just say in our model and most power rankings, Illinois is like a team in the 50s. Their schedule kind of made them who they are, but they got blown out in all the 3 really good teams they played. But USC in overtime sort of says a little bit, but then Wisconsin, you win soundly. Ohio State's a close game. Washington's a blowout. Oregon is a very close game. This is a team, Daniel, that is rightly, I think, like in our metrics right now, 1 through, you can go to our website, collegefootballnerds.com, and look at our computer-based metrics where we take every team in the country. We play a mock schedule versus every other team, heavily matchup dependent. It's a pretty sophisticated model we run. And it has Penn State 9th, sandwiched between SMU and Alabama. And I think that's consistent. To your point, right, we often say we often won't drop you. If you're 6th in the country and you lose to number 4, number 1, and they're close games, there's nothing in my mind that says that you can't be number 6 and lose to number 4 and number 1. And so I think Penn State is rightly where they're at. I mean, they beat Illinois, that's on the border of the rankings. USC, from a power rating standpoint, usually somewhere between 15th and 25th, despite their overall record. Where I think the conversation gets a little more nuanced is that you want to turn that around and turn it to SMU, right? Because the argument for Penn State in this discussion is they're a team that can play with the 2 best teams they played. They were both relatively close games. They showed they belong on that stage. As much as we are somewhat skeptical, they showed they belonged, I think, more than we thought they would. SMU, on the other hand, lost to the 2 currently top 25 teams they played in BYU and Clemson. And those 2 teams are a lot further back in the rankings. But, Daniel, I think there's truth to that and there's deception to it. Because I think it is true that they showed that they lost to those games. But again, Daniel, they were 2 close games. The Clemson game was a game that SMU came back, almost won. Was close to driving it overtime. I think they were maybe shell-shocked in the first half. And the other thing with BYU is they didn't have the current starting quarterback. So, Daniel, I'll turn it around to you. Having that conversation with Penn State, do you have the same conversation with SMU, or is it as simple as they lost to worse teams than Penn State did, or is there a bit of an asterisk, and maybe is that an oversimplification?
Yeah, I thought the Clemson game was pretty misleading in that we all saw SMU claw back late, but there were a lot of points early in that game that showed some glimpses of SMU. So Jennings had a ball, I think it was in the second possession, where I think it was a deep post that he threw that either was either a linebacker playing center field or safety playing a little shallow. Got his hand on the ball, tipped it. I think it was third down. That ball would have been a walk-in touchdown. And there were a couple of plays like that offensively that SMU had that really hurt them on one side of the ball. And then a couple of plays like that offensively for Clemson where I felt like they played above their level, especially at quarterback. Klubnik made some throws that he hadn't made all year. And it artificially put Clemson in a lead that they normally wouldn't have if that game was played 10 times in a row. And so I think that's shown SMU in a light that maybe is not fair, and maybe they're a little bit better than they showed in that Clemson game. And if you look at their schedule, they handled their schedule in a way that a lot of teams, even in this playoff field, didn't. They had the early game against Nevada and the BYU game that was lost. Jennings did play in that game, but Stone also played in that game. He didn't really take the reins until after that BYU loss. But after that, offensively, they were a juggernaut all year, and they handled their schedule again in a way that a lot of teams didn't. And that's a theme that we've always had for, you can't always help your schedule. That's an important caveat we give. You can't help that if you play bad teams, you might be good or you might be a paper tiger. It's hard to know until you play other good teams. But Josh, I want to turn this around to you and ask you, maybe a negative for Penn State, maybe not. If you look at their schedule, while it is, I think, a positive they were able to play with Ohio State, they were able to play with Oregon. If you look at their schedule, they didn't do anything on their schedule to a team that other teams didn't do to that team. Like USC, they beat USC in overtime. USC lost to bad teams. Minnesota lost to mediocre teams. That game was 26-25. Wisconsin, that was, I think, 28-13. Wisconsin got blown out by multiple teams, right? So if you go down the schedule, you've got a close game with Bowling Green. You've got an ugly game with Illinois. You've got a kind of ugly game with Wisconsin, although I do think that score is a little not fair to Penn State. But overall, you can go down their entire schedule. And other than maybe the Maryland game, Penn State didn't do anything outside the bounds of what we saw other teams do to their schedule. So, having said all that, are you concerned, or is it valid to say that maybe this is a potential negative for Penn State? Is there a concern there? I'll let you handle that one. Talking about conference championship games, we're talking about playoff games, we're talking about the fact that this is the first year ever that teams are going to be hosting these games at home, probably higher ticket allotments. We've got a partner, a sponsor on this one that's going to help you find those tickets. It's SeatGeek. Josh, why don't you let us know what SeatGeek's got going on?
If you want to go out there and find a way to go watch the first year ever with home game, playoff games, go to South Bend, go to Happy Valley. SeatGeek is the #1 rated app on the internet for finding tickets. 28 million downloads, 70,000 events, anything from sports to music. If you go to the app, you can see everything they've got to offer. You can look at all the different events in your area. And if you think college football playoff, right here, anything you want to go to, they've got all the different events, all the different venues. SeatGeek, go look for the green dot. They rate the seats best to worst, 1 through 10. Green means good, red means bad. It's a great app and a great way to go see ball games.
By the way, you can use that app, you can use that website and preview what the seats would look like if you were sitting in them, which is a good way to help you decide which ones to purchase. And we came through for you guys. Use our code NERDS for $20 off tickets at SeatGeek. That's $20 off your first purchase with promo code NERDS. Make sure you click the link in the description and download that app.
I think the question brings a kernel of truth. And, if you're a Penn State fan, they're going to be split between raging at the statement you just made and then also probably acknowledging the reality that James Franklin has a reputation for losing the big games they play. That has continued to pan out. And Daniel, I think the truth of that is the reality of the sport. I think Penn State's been very consistent. We get sometimes called haters, sometimes not. Our position has consistently been that Penn State is a team that is somewhere between the 7th and 15th best team in the country about every year. Would you say that's accurate? And right now, their current ranking, right? They're the number 6 Penn State Nittany Lions. I'm of record of this, and I'll say it here, and I'll say it in the other video. I think Penn State should have fallen behind Ohio State. I don't know why they didn't. Ohio State beat them. They are here because of their schedule, period. And when I say here, I don't mean in the playoffs, because Penn State is a playoff caliber team. I think they're one of the 10 best teams in the country. They should be in the playoffs. They are 6 specifically because the only one of the big 3 they played during the regular season was Ohio State, and they lost that game. And so to your point, look, I think that there are some things that are a little different about them this year. In particular, Drew Allar in the passing game, I think, has come a long way. We have been very critical of him. The last 2 years, Daniel, he was a 5.7 yard per attempt passer in 2022 and a 6.8 yard per attempt passer in 2023. Those are bad numbers. 7.5 yards per attempt is the mark for a competent passing game. This year, he's currently at 8.9. And now he's had a couple bad games. He was 5.8 against Oregon, 6.6 against Maryland. But still, even in prior years, even in games where they were playing like Massachusetts last year, he was 7 yards per attempt. He's not been great. And so I think they are a little more dangerous than they have been. I think the defense maybe is a little more dangerous than it has been in some ways. I think Abdul Carter gives them something a little special. And now they've had some absolute game wreckers, right? There's a certain guy wrecking the NFL as a pass rusher right now that came out of there. But I think the sum of its parts for them as a team is extremely good. And I think, we've been critical of the receiving core. I think the receiving core with Warren got a little something extra. They have an NFL caliber tight end. The same way Brock Bowers made Georgia special, I think Warren, I don't know that he's quite Brock Bowers, and that's not an insult. I think Brock Bowers is truly, when people say generational, it's usually overused. I think Bowers is actually generational, like best in 10 to 20 years. Warren, though, is in that category. NFL number 1, looks like he'll be I think he could be a top 5 or 6 tight end in the NFL, truly. And that has given them something that I think makes them more competitive in these games. Daniel, I also think that they're benefiting from something we've talked about a lot. And I know there are going to be people that watch all our videos. I encourage you to watch we're going to do videos for every playoff game. Like, subscribe, hit the notification bell if you haven't done so, if you find this interesting. And I'm sorry I'm a little congested today, but there's only so much I can do about that. Games have become shorter because they changed clock rules. We used to average about 75 plays. It's pushing more like 55 in big games. If you look at the plays per average in a game, it's not that different. That's deceptive because so many games they intentionally run out the clock. In big competitive games, they've gotten quite a bit shorter. Brian Fremeau's done some work on that. That on the edges, these high impact games, they specifically are considerably shorter. That and defenses catching up schematically with the RPO has made a big difference. I think those things are keeping games lower scoring, and it's made Penn State more competitive because it's not letting the Ohio States run away from it in the fourth quarter when Penn State gets a little tired and the offensive skill talent takes over, like we've seen a couple times in the past. And so I think that all plays into their hands. So, Daniel, in the whole, the thing I would say is they have a more complete passing game. I think they were really limited against high-level defenses. Allar has taken a step forward. We still butt heads with people over that. Look, it's just a matter of, again, where do you want to set the overall ranking? Where do you want to set expectations? I think Allar is a good quarterback. I do not think Allar is a first-round draft pick, which I think a few years ago people would off and on try to argue for, or he was headed that way, and in my opinion was always silly. I think he's become a good to very good quarterback this year with 3 years in this system. I think Penn State is a very good football team. Are they one of the 5 best overall teams from a quality perspective? I think the answer is no. Are they capable of winning one of those games in a way that they maybe weren't in prior years? I think the answer to that's yes. And so I think that's like a long discussion, Daniel, but I think that's where they're at. And Daniel, I'll turn this around and talk about SMU because I know you have been really positive on SMU. You put out a tweet. You were kind of predicting they beat Clemson. And it looked silly probably to some people in retrospect because people always look at results and they want to ignore any of the reality that college football is an unpredictable sport at some level. Look, I think SMU is a very good team. I think SMU, as much as we were critical of putting them in there, deserves to be there. And I think they're a quality football team. And I think it's interesting when you look at this matchup, where Penn State's favored, where somebody's favored in the model. Spoiler alert, it's a little surprising. I think SMU absolutely belongs, and I think a lot of what SMU is as a football team, um, actually matches up pretty well with Penn State from an overall quality perspective. I think the issues are going to come down to the specific matchups.
Yeah, I think, look, it really comes down to whether or not you think SMU's run defense is as legit as the numbers show, or is their run defense a product of playing a weaker schedule? And we talk all the time. SMU fans might be new to this, but you can't necessarily help your schedule in a lot of ways. So you can play a weak schedule and still be an elite team, but a weak schedule can also artificially present you as a great team. And you don't know until you play somebody. And to this point, SMU has not played somebody on the level of a playoff caliber team. So right now, for me, it's an incomplete because look, for all the negatives or mediums about that feelings that I have about Drew Allar, and look, I think the 5.8 yards per attempt against Oregon is pretty notable because if you look at how Allar's been in big games, like it's not been great. Like it just really hasn't. He balled out fourth quarter of USC, but up until that point, he wasn't doing great. Ohio State, he threw for 146 yards on 20 attempts. Not great. But look, here's the thing. They didn't score 37 points on Oregon because Allar was balling out. They didn't need him to because they ran for 300 yards on 8.7 per. They had two running backs go for 100 yards. Drew Allar himself ran for 50 yards. So really, this game, I think Jennings is going to get his in this game. I do think that Penn State's defense, Clemson's defense is known as being great. It's not as great this year. Clemson does not have a typical Clemson defense other than the fact that they have white guys sprinkled everywhere, which has been typical of their run through this run. But their defense has not been a vintage Clemson defense. So people see SMU putting up, I think, 31 on them and saying, oh, wow, their issue was SMU's issue was defense, not offense. There is a world where SMU runs into this game and gets shocked and exposed. I don't think that's the world we live in. Now, having said that, I don't know what they're going to do in terms of run defense if they're a paper tiger or if they're actually going to be able to hold Penn State to a below average game.
And let me get into some of the true analytics and modeling to break that down a little bit, Daniel. So to your point with Clemson, and we'll get more into this in the preview for that game specifically. Clemson is interesting of all the playoff contenders in the first round at least. They're a bit of an outlier. Everybody else has a top 10 statistic in one of the major areas that we track. Clemson is the one team that does not. But to your point, Daniel, defensively, we track 6 different defensive areas. They are not top 30 in any of the 6. And when you look at prior years, they were frequently, top 15, top 20, right? Top 10.
In everything.
The better championship teams, yeah. And their championship teams were number 1 by stupid margins. So this is a real rarity. And I say that to say that SMU, I'm with you. It's a mistake to view them that way because SMU is our 10th best run defense, 41st best passing defense. And there's an interesting point there, Daniel. They held teams to 6.5 yards per attempt, and that is only good for 41st in our system because of how bad, and I think this flew under the radar, just how bad a lot of passing offenses were in the ACC this year. And I think you think back and you point to some like Louisville and you say, well, they were good. Well, Louisville threw the ball on SMU a fair amount. Schaff was pretty successful in that game. Ja'Cory Brooks was pretty successful in that game. There are a lot of other teams in that conference that just did not end up having the passing games that were expected. And so, you look at games like, teams, I don't know, Virginia, we knew they were bad. California hasn't thrown the ball very well throughout the season. FSU was way worse than expected in terms of passing offense. Stanford can't throw. Just go down the list. There's a lot of teams. And the ones like Pitt, when Holstein was healthy, SMU, Louisville, they've stood out. And I would argue they've stood out, Daniel, because they can throw the football, right? And so that's the first thing I'll say. But in that, their run defense, again, is 10th. And SMU, for an offensive profile, 7th in passing offense, 52nd in rushing. So this is a team that very much goes through Jennings. I agree with you. Watching him on tape, I am very high on Jennings as a quarterback. Again, they lost that BYU game close. They lost that game without Jennings. I do not think they lose that game with him. He's made them a very different team. He reminds me a lot of, gosh, what was his name? Was it like Chucky Keaton, the guy at Utah State that played, I think, 18 years, give or take. I'm going to look this up while I'm talking, which is a terrible idea both for, Chucky Keaton. That's a good memory from like 2015, where kind of a dual threat guy, gamer, off-arm angle throws, making stuff happen. That's what Jennings looks like, and he looks like now as a young player. I think he's only going to get better. I'm really impressed with his ability to throw off angle, sidearm. His ability to drive the ball on seam routes is pretty special. I am not thrilled with his deep ball, going to be honest. Once he has to put Aaron... There are a lot of quarterbacks like this, especially young guys that are really good athletes. They're really good driving it. They are not good at floating it. I've had the same critique of a lot of really good athlete quarterbacks. Io Maliava is actually another guy that I really flagged this on early this year. He's got a little bit of that, but he's still young. But otherwise, he's got it. He's mobile in the pocket. He makes things happen. He extends plays. And in many ways, honestly, to me, he looks like a young Jaden Daniels. It's the best comp I have. I mean, he's really, really, really good. The problem you run into, Daniel, is when you compare him to Penn State, right? So we said that they're top 10 in passing offense, run defense. Well, Penn State's the number 4 passing offense, actually, in our system. Again, the pass game is tremendously improved. The number 7 passing defense, so it's strength on strength when SMU wants to throw the football. But more importantly to me, they're top 25 in rush offense and rush defense. And that, to me, Daniel, is the big difference, because rush offense for SMU is 52nd, pass defense for SMU is 41st. That means when Penn State's throwing the football, it's strength on weakness, whereas SMU must go strength on strength. Penn State is a more balanced team. And I think within that confine, it's interesting when you look at the model, how it comes out, because the model does actually favor SMU by a slight margin. And I can talk a little bit why that is and the philosophies behind the model. Our model, just like all our statistics, those rankings I was given, we based that on something called expected performance. Basically, how have you done against your competition? How has your competition done against everyone else? And we do a lot of interrelated work with that and cross-correlate all the data and recompile it to have purely opponent-adjusted statistics. And we feed those statistics in our model, which is sort of a machine learning approach that basically says, how did you play in every game? What did it take for you to win in each game? We look at that actually through the lens of this expected performance concept, and we do it more, more like per drive and unit basis, not like points per yard. And then, we take that, create sort of scoring models for each team, look at the individual matchups of the two teams to get a comparison. And then, based on that, saying like, hey, based on this team, how this team's expected to throw, expected to run, based on their prior profiles this year, how do we expect them to do? And that has this game 25.5 to 23 or 26 to 23 SMU over Penn State. But Daniel, I want to flag a couple things on that. First, Penn State's actually expected to outgain SMU 5.3 yards per play to 5 yards per play. People that have followed our channel for a long time will know that often the yardage statistics that we generate are more accurate than the points statistics, or the point margins. That's unsurprising because points is random bounce of the ball, as we say all the time, especially when you're below 20 points. I believe this game has an over-under, if I want to say, of 52. So this is right around that range. I think it's shorting Penn State about 6 points. But Penn State's expected to run it better. They're expected to throw it better. 8.5 yards per attempt to 3.7 yards per carry versus 7.1 yards per attempt, 3.4 yards per carry for SMU. And in short, when you look at all the various statistics, Penn State has an advantage defending the run. They have an advantage throwing the football in the 10 to 20% range. And then they've got a slight disadvantage when SMU's throwing the football or when Penn State wants to run, actually. All that said, how do you get to a point margin that's, more than a touchdown? And hopefully you can give me the actual number because I can't remember right now.
8.5.
In Penn State's favor.
8.5.
8.5. That's what I thought. You go from a 2.5 point deficit to 8.5. It's a 10-point swing. Daniel, I think it's the thing that you said earlier, which is shock value from the Clemson game, and it's something that jumped out on me on tape. We actually have a caveat in our model to say that teams playing very weak schedules are typically overvalued. You see that, for example, Tulane is top 15. Oklahoma's like 52nd in our model. Oklahoma soundly beat Tulane. It just looks like the better team. When you play weak schedules, there are scaling issues that happen in this sport. There are things you want to do and way you do things that do not work when you play better teams, particularly because of defensive speed, disruption, better defenses with better athletes. These days are much better able to defend the RPO because the linebackers can drop in schemes. We've had way too many conversations about that. Go watch the Georgia-Texas preview. There's a really interesting conversation we had about the RPO. I'll leave it at that rather than rehash it if you're curious about that idea. But in short, when you watch the first quarter to half of the Clemson game, Jennings was rattled and that offense didn't work. And I think the reason for that was twofold. One, Clemson could stop the run effectively without having to load the box. But two, more importantly, they are just better athletically in the front end than anybody SMU had seen, probably including BYU. And what that did is when you have a really mobile quarterback like Jennings that I said he's good at off angle, he is too willing to throw off angle. Frankly, his mechanics when he gets pushed out of the pocket get bad. He'll throw off his back foot. He gets away with it a lot. But you get away with it a lot more when you got guys over the top of the defense, which Clemson didn't let them do because they could play them more straight up. And so I think the concern, again, comes down to the fact that Penn State has this guy named Abdul Carter. They have two excellent running backs. And so if you want to play that same style of offense and defense, I think it gets a lot harder versus the big uglies that Penn State and others have. SMU versus FBS teams with a winning record has only been giving up 1 sack a game, which is pretty special. This is a roster that was rebuilt out of the transfer portal. They're better than most people realize. But I think Penn State presents a different kind of test. And I think that is why this margin is 8.5. But the reason it is only 8.5 is SMU is still a very good football team. They're going to be able to score points and keep this, I think, reasonable. Like, score in the mid-20s means a pretty competitive, somewhat low-scoring game, which I think is accurate because SMU can stop the run. But I think most of this comes down to, as you said, can SMU sort of weather the storm of the fact that this will be by far the best set of fronts that they've played all year? Can Penn State exploit SMU in the back end? Because I think it's possible, at least on paper. And how is this game going to go? And Daniel, before I turn it back to you, I'll say one thing. We've had, a lot of discussions on Twitter, people getting angry at us, whatever, on had a whole view on the playoffs and who should be in. Both of us felt like Alabama should be in over SMU based on resume because SMU's strength of schedule isn't very good. It's just not. It was second worst in all the power conferences going into the conference championship game. It is what it is. That philosophy aside, I think Clemson was the bigger problem in that. We just assume Clemson has to be in because of the format, but the issue is they forced Clemson in due to the format when the reality is Clemson should have been left out even as a winner. Having lost 2 SEC games in particular, whole other discussion. I actually, Daniel, was fully expecting when I thought Alabama was probably going to be in this game to pick Penn State because of their front. Because I think Alabama has a real issue when they play teams that can stop the run at a certain level. We saw it. What are 2 of their 3 losses have in common? What are their big offensive meltdowns have in common? They couldn't run against Tennessee. They could not run against Oklahoma. Those were the best 2 defensive fronts they faced, and they had the same meltdown. SMU has not played a team like that. And I bring this up to say when you have a mobile quarterback, when you are dependent upon balance, when you're RPO-based, when you're big play-based off the RPO and zone read and using the quarterback to keep a defense honest, which is what SMU does, you can experience different things when you play a defense that can shut down the run, especially if they can shut down the run without devoting extra resources to doing so. It breaks what you want to do schematically, and you can have really adverse results. And again, the Alabama example I'm bringing up is a scaling problem. Alabama cannot scale this year offensively versus teams that are better in the front 7, quite bluntly because Jalen Milroe has a lot of limitations as a quarterback, and it creates a lot of limitations for their offense when they can't run it. I don't think Jennings is that limited. I actually think Jennings is a better quarterback than Jalen Milroe. But they have not played a team that is really able to do that. The one possible exception was Clemson, in my opinion, and Clemson did give them fit. So, Daniel, that I think is why the model in Vegas differs. I'm going to go ahead and give you my score. I'm going to say this game 31-28 Penn State. I think it's a close game. I think SMU shows they belong on this stage because they're able to put up points. I think Penn State's just a little more explosive down the field and probably wins this one late. But I want to turn it back to you on this whole discussion. I mean, how do you suss this out? Do you think I'm on to something, or do you buy my reality about, it's not just scheduling, right? SMU's strength of schedule is not an ACC versus Big Ten thing. Let me be clear and be completely blunt with it. My biggest concern with SMU is probably the best teams, in my opinion, in that conference were Miami, they were Clemson, Georgia Tech, Syracuse. They did not play any of the best teams in the ACC. It's like if Penn State didn't play Ohio State, Oregon, or Ohio State or Oregon really in the regular, or Indiana in the regular season at all, and Oregon was the first team they played. That's the situation SMU's in. So it's all a bit of an open question. In a game they lost close and looked like they were good late. How do you suss all that out?
So one of the things we haven't talked about is prep time. And I think that defense travels, run game travels, and those things don't, whether you have a ton of time to prep for a run game or not a lot of time to prep for a run game, that thing is going to be what it is. And so from that standpoint, I want to give an advantage to Penn State. I do think you're onto something in that there's a real chance that SMU will be shocked again, because what they saw in Clemson was an elevated sort of roster overall, maybe not necessarily an elevated team, because Clemson, again, and I agree with you. I want to be clear, like SMU was the last team in, but they weren't the team that quote unquote screwed Alabama. It was Clemson. Clemson does not belong in this playoff field. I don't care that they beat SMU on a wild kick. If they don't make that kick, I think SMU wins in overtime. I think that SMU is a better team than Clemson. But I just go back to this notion that I think that, look, if Penn State can run for 300 on Oregon, that's a run game that's consistent. I don't need Drew Allar to put up 9 yards an attempt and 300 yards, in my mind, for them to beat SMU. I need them to be able to run the ball. I'm picking Penn State in this game only because I believe that they're going to be able to run the ball. I think Penn State is sleeping on SMU, just from the general tenor of the discussion that I see online. And that is, to me, if everybody knows that what you hear on online is truth, it's universal, it's reality. It's a joke. I think people are sleeping on SMU. They're a better team than they're getting credit for, but I don't think they're going to be able to stop Penn State's run game. And if you can stop their run game, it's game over. If Penn State runs for less than 150 yards in this game, they're going to lose, maybe by double digits. I just don't think that's going to be the case. Give me Penn State 30, SMU 24. SMU's going to get some points. They're going to move the ball. I think their passing game is going to shock Penn State a little bit. Penn State played 1.5 good passing offenses this year. Ohio State is decent. They have their issues, especially at offensive line. And Oregon put up 45. I think SMU is going to put up some points. I think Penn State's going to be able to run the ball, and it's going to enable Drew Allar to be functional in this offense in a way that he can be efficient. But SMU winning this game would not shock me at all. Clemson beating SMU kind of shocked me because I thought SMU was going to win that game by double digits. And I still think SMU is a double-digit better team, 9 out of 10 against Clemson, which is why I don't think Penn State should sleep on SMU. But I do think that Penn State wins this game just because defense, trenches, run game, that stuff travels, and SMU doesn't run the ball a lot. And they're going to rely – it all comes down to whether or not their quarterback can get hot. And I don't know that Jennings is going to be able to get hot enough to win this game. Close us out with something interesting, no pressure, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, you always do this to me. Give me an impossible question, but I have something for you this time.
Okay.
So, two things. One, I think this SMU team is very similar to the TCU team from a couple years ago that shocked Michigan in the first round. They've got a pretty good balance of offensive players that are underrated. They've got good quarterback play. There's some NFL talent on that team. And I think a lot like that same TCU team, they're either going to be in this game and working offensively, or they're going to get shell-shocked. And if they're shell-shocked, this could get really, really ugly. Because I don't think they want to be in a position where they're just having to throw the ball willy-nilly because Penn State's going to pin their ears back. And Penn State is built against a desperate team to run the ball and keep pressure on them against loaded fronts and still be successful. And to that mold, it is kind of interesting because the Oregon game, look, you look at that game and you say, wow, Oregon, 45 points. They threw for 283 yards, 8.8 per, 4 touchdowns. But 181 yards of that came to Tez Johnson by himself. The 48-yard long. He was the whole team. 11 receptions for him, 11 receptions for the entire rest of the team. No other receiver in that game had more than 30 yards. They just did not have an answer for Tez Johnson's speed. And when I watch SMU on tape, the receivers look athletic and fast. They get open. Daniel, the hardest thing for me to suss out in this game is really trying to understand how the team speed of SMU in the ACC is going to actually translate to playing Penn State. I just don't know. And this is one of those cross-conference things that becomes a real problem because of the lack of cross-conference data points. I think Penn State showed a real vulnerability in the back end that they seem to, like we talked about going into that game, that they've had issues with elite athleticism, and I think that showed versus Johnson in a nasty way that they could not cover him and they could not run with him, more importantly, on the back end. I don't know whether or not SMU has the ability to exploit it. And I can see a reality like TCU, Michigan, where they do exploit it, and it seems like Penn State can't cover them. And I also see a reality where it's such a step up in competition that SMU's receivers, who they are a little bit receiver by committee, even though they're good. Daniels, Smith, Hudson, whoever, just they don't really dominate the game. They don't get open and they get shut down. So the variance to me on this outcome is wide. I think SMU from a quality standpoint actually probably does belong, probably. But Daniel, I will also say, I also think there's a real possibility that Clemson and SMU in this playoff both get completely exposed. And I think this could happen to any conference. I think it can happen to the Big Ten. I think it can happen to the SEC. The lack of out-of-conference data points is really troubling to me. I don't know how we compare the athleticism level. So there's a lot here in both of our projections, I think, that are sort of taking the average, assuming the talent level between these conferences is fairly close, maybe a bit better in the Big Ten, which is the consensus. That may not actually be the case, and we may just not realize it. And maybe the ACC is actually better offensively and defensively. There's some reasons, at least some hope for that. Georgia Tech, Georgia, Louisville blowing out Kentucky. We don't know. So, yeah, but the short version of it is I agree with you. It's a team you shouldn't take lightly. They remind me a lot of that TCU team in a lot of ways, and they're very dangerous offensively. They are scrappy defensively more so than are projected. And if they can get rhythm, they can be in this game. And I think if they're not in rhythm, there's a real danger that they will get manhandled because I don't think they have the personnel from a size perspective to deal with a team that is able to lean on them and pin their ears back.
All right, y'all. Let us know in the comments what you think about this game. If you think we're crazy and that maybe that SMU is not up to snuff, or if they're better than people think, let us know. Keep an eye out for our other previews this week. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.